Hey there, YouTube. Are you a business professional that's stuck working from home and still using a webcam like this? Or maybe you want to upgrade to an image like this? I'm not a big fan of paying the price gougers right now on Amazon for camera equipment and Logitech webcams that are way overpriced, but in fact, this is actually just a phone. Pretty easy way to improve your experience with your customers, partners, and your colleagues. Then let's say we really want to jump off the deep end and we want to upgrade our image to look something like this. Well, interesting enough, if you happen to have one of these sitting around from a trip you might have done with the family to Europe, what have you. Many of the manufacturers for these cameras have actually come out with upgrades to be able to use them as webcam utilities with the USB connections that are in them today. So I can start off by saying this is not my day job. This is a weird hobby I went off on because I, like probably many of you, are really cut off from the face-to-face communication that we were having with our customers and our colleagues and our partners for quite a long time during this human malware 2020. And after a couple months, it really felt like we need to get back with it and get face-to-face with each other and not just be on the phone all the time. And so I started digging into that, put together some content for our internal teams that I work with on a day-to-day basis on how to improve that experience. Thought it might be beneficial to other folks that are out there. So again, not my day job on here. There were plenty of videos on YouTube that go very, very deep into these topics. Most of them are made for presenting information one way, vlogging, Twitch streaming, things like that. This is going to be a bit more about two-way communication through video conference apps. So what are we going to do today? First off, we're going to look into, well, why you should probably get on camera at this point if you're in a business setting. Second, how do we hook up things that we might have around the house? Basically anything with a lens that was made 2012, 2013 or later, probably going to be hooked up to your computer as a webcam, like this Hero GoPro. Things like digital camcorders, if they're made after that time, will work like that. But I'll cover a couple different options, and then finally I'll show you how to connect those into things like Microsoft Teams, WebEx. If you're unfortunate enough to be a LogMeIn, GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting user, that's actually a little bit more difficult. I'm going to do a second video on how to set up a virtual cam and pipe your video in to make that work. Log me in, guys. You're really killing me on this. Everybody else works the exact same way, except for you. Anyway, if you're interested in these topics, follow me in. We're going to spend most of the video in this chair, so why don't we do something else and open up the conversation over here. Okay, so why is a software sales rep producing a video on webcams or hooking up various different devices on webcams, especially when the last webcam I purchased prior to lockdown was this thing right here, which has not had support since Windows 7. This was not a topic that I was big on months and months ago before lockdown, but it's a big reason of that is because I used to be face-to-face with our customers all the time, face-to-face with my colleagues all the time, and didn't really necessarily need to be on webcam that much. And so now, granted, 14 hours a day, every day for 5 or 6 months at this point, maybe I picked up a weird hobby, maybe I just have a screw loose, but this is something I became very, very fascinated with and started digging into quite a lot of other videos of people teaching me how to do things with lighting, cameras, sound, what have you. Wanted to impart some of that knowledge on you here. Where this video actually came from is several weeks ago I was on an internal set of QBR calls. It was 2 full days of calls and not a single person was on video the whole time. And that really struck me as to how much of our communication spectrum we were losing by just being on audio all the time. I mean, when you meet with your customers or your partners or your colleagues on a regular basis. I mean, I was with my customers, at least every customer once a month or so. My colleagues, we'd all get together at least once a quarter. I'd establish a certain, recording in the back of my mind of how somebody meant to communicate. And you'll do this subconsciously as well. You'll know Do they speak kind of forward like this? Do they speak with their hands? Are they usually happy when they're communicating? You have this visual imprint of how somebody's intending for a message to come across, so that in the in-between times when you're not on a face-to-face meeting with them, when you're not with them, you hear them on the phone, that's the thing that you recall. That's the video in the back of your mind that helps you to translate the message that they were trying to send across. Now, you go enough time without seeing anybody, and that message, of course, starts to fade away. And so while we can't necessarily all be face-to-face with each other right now, at least turning on a camera, whatever that camera may be, whatever that background may be, can reinitiate some of that recall. And of course, that's very important, because as humans, we're constantly streaming both verbal and nonverbal communication. The words we're sending across, the tone of those words, our facial expressions when we're speaking, how we're holding ourselves and our hand gestures, that all wraps up into a message that's then translated to the person receiving it on the other end of the line. And if we aren't ever on video, and they have lost that kind of recall of what we intended and how we communicate verbally, well, we're really not delivering necessarily the message that we want to intend across, what our customers or what our company may want to communicate across. And so we've got to be able to improve this. If you want to understand the impact of all of this visual, all this nonverbal communication, go check out a podcast that is both recorded just for the audio, and the same podcast that's recorded in a live studio where you can see the video as well. Joe Rogan, that's a great example of this. You can go and listen to the audio, and then you can go out on YouTube and see the recordings from in the studio, and you'll notice that you get this very different depth of range, this depth of communication when you see somebody on the video version of that podcast or that YouTube stream. So make sure to check that out. The other thing, of course, most school children know that we speak with more than just our voices ourselves. There's this entire nonverbal communication range. But also keep in mind how important this is when we're at work from home, when we're on this constant thread of web meetings. It's not just about the message you're trying to give across and your visual coming through when you're speaking. In fact, you've probably heard the term, you speaking with a smile. People can hear when you're speaking with a smile, but what they can't tell is, without a video, without any visual cue, are you an active listener? Are you listening when they're speaking, when you're not the one delivering a message? And that's really big right now, because I don't know when I'm speaking with somebody, are they actually paying attention to my message? Are they flipping around on social media on the side? Are they, on mute fighting with their kids over on the other side? So turning that on and letting them know you're engaged, looking at the camera, listening intently to what they're saying, that's huge and generates respect with, again, everybody that you work with, everybody that you're trying to communicate with. It will also have an interesting consequence of them turning their camera on and generally sharing that feedback with you as well, that communication spectrum coming back at you. This doesn't happen all the time, but generally when I turn on my camera, whether the person I'm communicating with is in the right setting, has the right things on, is really ready for it, what have you, a lot of times they'll reciprocate that as well, and it just builds our relationship that much more, and we don't feel quite so cut off from each other. So please make sure to turn on your camera. Now, if your limitation is you don't have the right hardware for that, or you have the little finger camera thing that I was showing at the beginning that is our company issued webcams, now that's something that we can solve for. And that's really the point of the rest of this video, as I get off the soapbox and let's get into some of the technical topics here. So let me show you various different solutions to using different devices like your phone, other cameras, what have you, as a webcam, and let's check that out. To show you that, we're going to shift over a little bit up here so you can see the test scenario. All right, let's give you an idea of what we're going to look at from behind the scenes at this point. All right. So So that should give you a better idea of what we're looking at. First off, this video is definitely on the longer end of the spectrum, so I'm going to, within the video description below, I'll put timestamps if you want to jump forward to certain setups, certain configurations. Just know some of the content builds on itself, so you may miss a little bit if you do that, but completely understand, long video. What you see now is what we're going to be using as the base for every camera we look at. First off, this little magic arm that's mounted to my desk with a clamp goes up, and right now I have a little webcam, which is the first thing we'll use for a baseline for the various different camera setups. Now, of course, with a webcam, typically we would hook that directly to the monitor, but that doesn't work for heavier cameras like a DSLR with an articulating mount like this. So we need something standardized. This is sitting 6.5 feet from the wall behind me, and as you saw in the opening video, and you'll see throughout the rest of the video, there's a grid on the wall, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Also note that every camera has been set so it looks right over the top of the bezel of my monitor, so that shouldn't be getting in the way for most of what we look at today. The GoPro is such a wide field of view that you're going to see the back of the monitor there. But anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea from behind the scenes of what we're going to be looking at. Now let's jump in directly into the camera and see what's going to go on the rest of the time throughout our tests. Okay, so this should give you a better idea of what we're working with. This is a webcam, so we're going to start with that as a baseline. In fact, this is probably one of the most common webcams in the world. I'll get into that in a second. The tripod that you're looking at is 6.5 feet roughly from the wall behind me. And then on the wall, you'll see that I have markers at 3 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, and then every 2 feet out as we go out to the left, and I'm practicing my best airline attendant hands. So that should give you an idea as we go through different cameras and different setups, what the field of view ends up looking like. Everything that I show is in 1080p, 30 frames per second, 709 color space, color range is partial if you get into those types of things. All of that except for the DSLR, the bigger cameras that we see right back here. Those have the white balance set on it because you can do that once, set it and forget it, and don't have to worry about that in software after the fact. So what you're looking through right now is a Logitech C920. It came out in January 2012, and I believe it was the first webcam, or at least mainstream webcam, to stream 1080p. And in fact, webcam technology hasn't changed a whole lot since this time. So you'll probably see a lot of these around. It's hooked up over USB 2.0. The field of view on this is a 78-degree field of view. I'll try and bring that up on a couple cameras. It has an autofocus, so as I move around, it's going to keep the focus very, very well. It doesn't have anything like a depth of field, though, because it has that unlimited depth, unlimited focus range. It doesn't have anything like the blurry background that you're able to get with some other cameras. There's a lot of things that you can do within the Logitech software or software that I'll show in my next video that gets into OBS Studio around color control, white balance, but you'll notice that the lighting quality is pretty bad right now. In fact, I have 6 light bulbs above me. They're all 5500 Kelvin, which is the same color we're going to use throughout all of the different camera setups today. Of course, if you watch any sort of video on improving your visual clarity over a Teams meeting, GoToMeeting, business, video conference, what have you, you'll find that people use a light out in front of them. Or if they happen to be doing videos primarily during the day, you might want to put your desk so there's a window behind you and you get that natural light in there. The key is getting that light diffused so it's not this harsh light that's coming in. So you can do that with like a light box. You can get different make from home filters, things like that you can set up for a few dollars if through a trip to Walmart, what have you. To give you an idea of what that looks like and how big of a change that makes, I have this little light right here. It's a remote battery powered LED light, and it is set to 5500K, and we're only going 15% as bright as that can show. So let me show you what that looks like. Of course, for a business meeting, you probably don't want light out to the side like this. We're not going for artistic photos. And as we bring it around, we'll notice that that's kind of the angle we want. We don't want deep shadows going on. You're able to see my face much better on this. And as we go out to the side, again, way too much shadow. The light that we're going to use primarily today will be at a position about right there. Of course, if you're doing this, you don't want to have the light in view there. So let me turn that off. And let's go with the lights that we're going to use the rest of the time. First off, let's turn on a front light. And this is a softbox that's not an overly expensive one. But again, there's fairly inexpensive options you can build from home. And then let's do one other thing and nerd out on this a little bit. Notice the background behind me is still very dark. So let's lighten that up. Alexa, turn on background light. There we go. Isn't that a lot better? So this is the image that we'll use the rest of the time, and you probably noticed on your end that this visual quality is significantly improved to what we had when we started this up. So last thing I'm going to do, I want to turn off these overhead lights since we have so much other light that's directional going throughout the room. So give me just a second, we'll get those turned off. All right, so last thing that I wanted to cover on this camera in particular is before we went into lockdown, you used to be able to get these for $60, $70 easy. Today they go for over $150 on Amazon, and I saw them higher even a couple months ago, which is just ridiculous. If you're going to spend $150 on a camera, you should buy a camera that the manufacturer intended at MSRP to be $150. Get a better camera. And, you know, really I have an issue with feeding these price gougers, which is really the point of the video today, which is, what else, again, can we use instead of this type of camera? Well, one of the things you probably have sitting around is, well, a phone. These are great cameras. In fact, if you look at, say, the latest iPhones out there, these cameras, this is like a 12 megapixel camera in this thing. It's phenomenal. And to be able to use one of these as a webcam is pretty easy. I recommend tethering it. I'll show you what to do here in a second, but you need your phone, or you can use an iPad for this as well. Of course, you need to prop it up somehow. So to do that, we use a little alligator clip like this. This one I think costs $10 on Amazon. And then I need either a tripod or buy a little mini tripod. You'll see one in the back there on the bigger DSLR camera. Whole setup, including software, little tripod, whole thing, $28, something like that, and you get a phenomenal camera resolution. So let's swap these around. I'm going to put the iPhone where you're seeing the camera right now. We'll see what that looks like. All right, so now you're looking at my iPhone 11 hooked up, tethered directly to the computer over a cable, set up as a webcam. Important to note nowadays that within your phones, the camera's probably the majority of the cost that's baked into it nowadays. There's phenomenal cameras built into these things. In fact, you'll notice that compared to the dedicated Logitech webcam, the room's probably a little bit brighter now at this point. That's because there's a fairly broad aperture within this. It's a f-stop 2.4 for comparison. We look at the DSLRs later on. And that brightens up the room quite a bit. I don't need so much of a light in front of me. I tested out two different applications for doing this. One was called WebCam and one is iVCam. Both of them allow you to use your flash on your camera or your phone in this case as a light source. You can use the front or back of the camera, and you can also hook them up over Wi-Fi or tether them, although I have to give you the disclaimer that I have a couple networks in the house, and it was a little bit more difficult to get it to work over Wi-Fi, so the tethering was a bit more stable for me. Fairly cheap to do this. The apps run roughly $10. There are free versions of these as well that you should test out before you buy the actual app. What you're seeing right now is iVCam, but let me cover both of these. Again, can do 1080, 30 frames per second. WebCam works on both Android and iPhone, and it also allows you to stream your audio from your phone in as a virtual microphone. Now, you probably don't want to use your embedded speakerphone as your microphone. Get some earbuds at least, maybe a mic clip or something like that. But it is a nice function if you needed it. What I am showing you right now, though, is iVCam. My biggest issue with iVCam is they charge an extra $20 for a virtual audio setup, which I really wasn't a big fan of. I was going to film this on WebCam, But iVCam gives you a huge range of control over your image that you didn't get within EpicCam. So I can control the exposure, the ISO, the white balance, get a lot better video image out of that. So real quick, let me show you what that looks like within the camera itself, and then we'll come back here. Okay, so let's see what happens actually in the app. Again, I'm tethered directly into the computer, but now you're getting a screen capture actually off of the phone itself. When we pull this up, we hook it in. I already have the app installed, have software installed on my desktop. I also have iTunes up in the background because for some reason both of these programs, EpicCam and iVCam, seem to primarily want to work when iTunes happens to be running in the background. So now you're seeing the front camera on the phone. A couple different things that we're able to change from a settings perspective here. But the big thing you probably need to know about is if we haven't had a connection, we start on this screen at this point, and on the top right you see this little cog. This allows you to change all sorts of things like the video size. We can bump the frame rate up to 60 frames per second. By the way, on the video you can do 4K if you need to do that. If you need to reserve a little bit more bandwidth on your network, you can drop the video quality down, change the encoding, things like that. In case your phone isn't getting a video out to the desktop application. So most of what you want to do though is actually on your computer itself. So let's close this down and go back to that view. Okay, now we're back to our original image. We have the iPhone back up on our tripod that's 6.5 feet from the wall behind me. Again, to get our bearings on distance, 2 feet markers here, foot markers going up. So we got that distance in place. The difference is now you're seeing this streamed into the iVCam software that's on your desktop or your laptop. And this is probably where you're going to make any of your visual control changes before we pipe this into a Teams, WebEx, GoToMeeting, what have you. First, and probably the most important thing to be aware of, if you have a computer that can handle it with a okay graphics card, make sure to have hardware decoding turned on. It's going to reduce the amount of lag between your audio and video signal. Also, the colors are going to be much better. Let's turn this off. You'll see what I'm talking about. So now you actually have a point of reference on what this video looks like, and what I have behind me on the wall is blue painter's tape. And so if you've ever used that before, you have a good local color reference for what that's supposed to look like, and now you see how washed out that is behind me. So we're going to turn that hardware decoding back on. And next up, we go up to settings, and these are all the same settings you saw on the phone itself. I can change the video size all the way up to 4K if I wanted to stream like that. I can change the frames per second up to 60. I can change any of those settings again we were looking at before. The thing then in the software that you probably want to pay a lot of attention to as far as visual camera control, and this is why I liked iVCam as opposed to EpicCam, is you have a lot of control as far as white balance, exposure, ISO. This little icon right here lets me use my camera for a light source for a key light. You can't see it with these other lights that I have going on right here. I can change and flip the camera to be upside down, change it left and right. Go back to this little one right here. I would not be using this for a business meeting, but if for some reason you wanted to, there's a glamour shots setting within this. Okay, let's get this thing turned off because that's pretty terrible. The other thing to be aware of is if you have a newer phone like an iPhone 11 here, there's actually 3 cameras in the back of the phone plus the front-facing camera. So I have the normal camera that we default to right now, but there's a zoom camera built into it. Keep in mind, again, this is about a 4-foot distance that we're seeing between here. So camera at the same place, our phone at the same place, able to zoom into that. If we wanted basically a GoPro from our iPhone, we can do that as well and get a huge range field of view. Let's change back to the regular camera at this point. All right, and you'll notice that the exposure, ISO, these things are changing as we're jumping between it. So the software does a pretty good job at that. All right, so we've seen how to hook up the iPhone for a camera, how to control some of the visual settings, a few nuances on that. Now let's jump over to how we actually put that into our well, let's use Zoom meeting. How about that? Let me pull over Zoom and blow this up. Now, again, you're probably going to want to set all of this before you get into a meeting, so you're not scrambling, toggling different switches in the software when you do that. But we're going to go to settings, and almost every one of the software programs works this exact same way, same kind of workflow. Click settings, and we're going to go to video. And you'll notice because I was using that Logitech camera earlier, I had this set to Logitech capture. You're going to see with the next one, we can use something like this EOS webcam utility. Let's jump over here to iVCam, and now we're able to see that visual. Other thing is, if you do have the bandwidth for it, make sure to turn on enable HD. I'm sure there's probably a couple other settings in here that we want to mess with within the advanced area, but I'm going to leave those alone for now. Then last thing we want to make sure to do is change over to audio. Keep in mind with a webcam, maybe you were using your integrated webcam mic as the audio source. I really wouldn't do that. Again, you can get a little lapel mic for $15 that is such a better audio signal. For me, I'm using speakers through this SSL mixer in front of me. Then the other thing to be aware of is, notice we've got a big red flag if I'm going to join a meeting like this. The audio signal is not bouncing up and down for me. That's because I'm using a separate mic than this. So I need to jump down and change it to this Rode video mic that I'm using. Now we have that bouncing back and forth. We know that people are going to hear us when we get into the meeting. I know I'm going to be able to hear people, and we've tested the video. So great. We've seen how to hook this up on Zoom. Most of the other apps work the exact same way. Now let's jump the next step down the trail of image quality that we can get into, and the iPhone is, again, great for this. Okay, and now let's say we want to jump a step further, and we happen to have a nice photography camera sitting around the house. Let's check out what we can do with something like that. Okay, so this camera should look very, very different than the last couple that we've looked at. This is a Canon EOS 90D digital SLR. It runs for about $1350 on Amazon currently. I think I picked it up for somewhere between $1,200, $1,250 after tax. The lens that it's currently using is a 24mm f2.8 aperture. It runs about $130. So if you're looking for cameras like this, make sure to shop around because the pricing goes crazy all over the place. And I'll circle back to the lens topic a little bit later, because that's one of the best things about using a camera like this. You have huge range of flexibility when it comes to those. So if you happen to already have a camera like this, a nicer digital SLR, back in April, many of the camera manufacturers started coming out with applications to be able to use these directly as webcams. I just plug this thing right into the computer via USB, and it shows up as a webcam in Zoom, WebEx, what have you. So if you have a Sony iVCam, Fujifilm, some of their X series and their GFX series, Nikon, all their mirrorless cameras and some of their D series, keep going, Panasonic, some of their Lumix cameras, and then of course, as I mentioned, this is Canon. This webcam utility works on both PC and Mac. Now, one of the catches is that this is supposedly only supposed to work down to certain camera series. So if you go into the Rebel series, this goes down and works down to the T6 Rebel. I looked for pricing on that on Amazon. It actually was cheaper to buy a T7 with a couple of lenses and a ton of accessories for like $400. And so don't go out and buy a T6 if you're looking for something like that. If you want to get into the mirrorless webcam area, the M200 mirrorless from Canon runs about $550 on Amazon, including a lens. But what's also interesting on these is I've not only had supported cameras work like that, but this is a Canon T3i. This thing is, I think I got it in 2011, something like that, maybe a little bit earlier than that. This is not a supported camera, and test at your own discretion, but I was able to get the T6 webcam software to work on this T3i, no problem. The only real big difference I'm able to see between this and that one, they have interchangeable lenses, that all works the same. The facial tracking on some of the older software is not anywhere near as good as what it is on the current generation cameras. So make sure to check that out. Okay, so there's several times where I'm going through editing and I just realize instead of explaining this to you, it's just easier to see it firsthand. So this is a great example. This is my Canon EOS Rebel T3i hooked up with a USB cord directly to the computer using Canon's free EOS webcam utility. Now, as a reminder, this is not a supported camera for that webcam utility. Happen to get it up and running. I'm sure my camera is probably going to melt or something because it's not a supported one on here. So use again at your own risk, but wanted to show you what that looks like. Here you are seeing a 4:3 ratio, that square image. That's what's going to come out of this camera by default when we hook it up through the webcam utility. The Canon 90D doesn't do that. You have other options. Just so you can see how you set that up in Teams. Again, very easy, just like any other webcam in most of these programs. I'm going to click down here and I can notice that the EOS webcam utility beta is already installed. It appears just like a webcam, just like my Logitech webcam was earlier. Choose that and we're good to go. All right, and there we go. We have our Canon EOS Rebel T3i, a camera that was not even supported by Canon within their webcam utility, now set up as a free webcam. Of course, you're probably not getting the best idea of what the video quality really looks like here because we're on this little tiny screen in front of you. So let's do this. Let's zoom in a little bit. And now we should have a better idea of what the video quality looks like. I think I mentioned this already, but I'm using my same lens that was on the Canon EOS 90D that we were using for the majority of these videos, interchanged onto this decade plus old camera that I had sitting around. So using the same lens, so you have a comparable image there. I think one of the reasons that cameras this old are not supported by Canon directly or listed within their EOS webcam utility is the autofocus. So within video, this camera does not do autofocus, which can be a bit of a problem if you're moving around. Now, if you're stationary and you're using this as a webcam, not the end of the world. Sit in front of it, have somebody take the autofocus picture for you and sit in that same spot. Or you might pick up something like a remote to take that picture of yourself. You need to do that before you plug the camera into your computer because you don't have those remote control focus capabilities once it's plugged in. But if you get that set up, great. You do need to deal with the square picture if that's a problem for you. Obviously, that this might be a limitation for this particular camera, but not a bad option if we're looking to get into something nice like a digital SLR for potentially less money than you're spending on a basic Logitech webcam nowadays. In fact, on eBay, right before this, I was looking this up, these cameras were going for about $120 or so. If you were looking for the base camera, battery, standard lens, they can get up to about $220 or so, again, used on eBay if we're talking about a broader set of accessories that might be included with it. So again, great option if you're looking to potentially get into that. Maybe it's a good option to check out. Let's continue. The other thing that you'll notice is, well, you might not actually, let me rephrase. You'll notice it right here because you're watching this in a much higher resolution than your audience would be, your customers, your partners would be on a Teams, WebEx, GoToMeeting. But this isn't actually sending a video feed over 1080p. In fact, I didn't even realize this for the first couple months of using it because the image was so much better than everything else. In fact, it's sending it at 1024 by 576 at 30 frames per second. Nowhere near 1080p. And well, why is this? Well, there's no decoding happening on the camera. It's trying to send a full raw feed across, whereas your webcams are decoding on the camera, sending a smaller feed, and it's decoded the other direction of coding on your computer. That's not happening here. And a USB 2.0, which is what the majority of Canon cameras are hooked up as, that doesn't have enough bandwidth. It's only able to send 60 megabytes per second. A USB 3.0, on the other hand, is able to send 640 megabytes per second. So 10 times as much data just by changing the type of cord that looks very similar. I mean, you're probably familiar with these types of cords out there. If you see the blue one, that's a USB 3.0. The USB 2.0s, those are the white ones. And in fact, all these Canon cameras are using these little micro mini USB connectors. So If you happen to have a 3.0 camera, you might actually be able to stream at a higher rate than what I'm showing right here. But it's actually not that big of a deal. And in fact, as I mentioned, I didn't even notice for the first several months that I was using this. And the reason is the image quality on this camera is so much better. I'm able to control so much around the colors, the white balance, the depth of field, which is also called bokeh. It's that kind of blurry background thing that you see in some of these little devices I have scattered around here. And being able to control that is far more important when we're talking about video conferencing than the actual resolution that's coming through, because in fact the resolution's changing all the time. GoToMeeting, they're sending a signal mostly in 640 by 480. WebEx called 640 by 360 a high quality video call. And I know Zoom can handle 1080p, no problem, but you have to have a lot of bandwidth to do it. And all of these providers seem to be changing on a week-to-week basis on how much video quality, how much bandwidth they're actually sending through. And so there's no guarantee that if you set up the perfect 4K ultimate setup that next week that's still actually going to present to your audience on the other side of the camera in that way. So I like the control on this approach, much better. Again, as I mentioned, DSLR, huge range of control, that bokeh, and better videos even at a lower resolution. So with that being said, what if we want to take this camera and pump out the best resolution we can and still get all that control over it? So let me show you how to do that. All right, so this is probably the image you were expecting to get out of something like a nice digital SLR camera, and that's because I'm sending this video feed out now over 1080p, 30 frames per second. And the way I'm able to do that is bypassing that little USB 2.0 signal and actually send this out over HDMI. So HDMI was, of course, made for TVs. It can handle 1080p, no problem. It can handle 4K, no problem. And in some cases, it can handle 8K. But of course, we're not going to stream to WebEx or something like that with 8K. In fact, in most cases, as I mentioned, 1080p isn't really even going to come across the signal in most cases. But in this case, again, I'm using HDMI, and of course I have HDMI coming out of the camera, but how do I get that into a computer that doesn't have an HDMI input? Well, the answer to that is we need an extra piece of hardware. In this case, we need a video capture card. I'm using this Camlink 4K, or actually I'm using its big brother that does the exact same thing right now. And on one end of this, you'll notice an HDMI. And on the other end, you'll notice a USB 3.0. Fun fact, if you didn't ever know this, that little blue tip that's right inside there, that denotes a USB 3.0, as opposed to the black and white ones that you see inside that are lower in signal, 1.0, 2.0. Now, this is an Elgato Camlink 4K. It can send all the way up to a 4K signal. It's a UVC device, means that we'll turn your camera directly into a webcam without fiddling with anything else, as long as you're using anything other than GoToMeeting. GoToMeeting, as I mentioned, very different with this particular setup. I'm going to have to do another video on that, of how to set up a virtual cam and pipe the signal back in. But as I mentioned, the Elgato Camlink, this is on the high end of capture cards. This is way overkill for what most people are going to use from a web meeting perspective. This device, MSRP, runs $120 or so. If you look around right now, they're still out of stock most places, and if they're not, price gougers are charging something like $300 for them. That's absurd. Please do not feed that machine. Instead, Amazon has plenty of alternative options that aren't the same name brand stuff, and AverMedia makes some really great stuff that isn't marked up in quite the same way that you find it like Best Buy. Now, the ones that I mentioned, the non-name brand ones on Amazon, you can get them for about $20 or so. Many of them are USB 2.0, but that's not so much of a concern in this case, because your camera, while that's not sending out a compressed signal necessarily, these devices are doing compression for you, so they can still handle a bigger video feed out over HDMI and change that in and put it in through USB 2.0. Again, the webcam we looked at, Logitech one at the very beginning of this, that was a USB 2.0 signal, but it was sending a compressed signal. So plug these into your computer, you're good to go, with one caveat. Not all cameras are supported by these. In particular, you need to find out if your camera can send a clean HDMI signal. If you've never seen what that looks like, it's what you're looking at right now. A HDMI signal that's not clean has all that heads-up display stuff around it. It shows your ISO and your exposure and all the other different factors around your camera coming through. And of course, if you tried to send that signal out to one of these devices, that's what's going to show up on the other end of your web meeting, is all those other little distractions around you. Oh, wait. Okay. Time out. I'm trying to explain clean HDMI, and assuming you know what a heads-up display and all these things look like, it's just easier to show this to you. So this is what happens when I turn off a clean HDMI output from the camera. I do lose a little bit of control when I turn on a clean HDMI of the visual stuff that's coming out of the camera, some of the different detailed settings. But this would look really weird to send over a Teams, WebEx, what have you. Looks again like the Terminator's looking back at me. So I've got these little things up here and down here. And now, it is kind of cool to actually see how the camera's working. So your cameras nowadays, when we look at these, the first couple things we looked at, they were doing no real tracking. Now we're actually seeing these things get pretty good nowadays as far as tracking the facial recognition around. In fact, you've seen me do this a couple times in the video where I need to look away. So here, for example, or if I'm putting up a product deal, I need it to focus here on a different device versus focusing on my face. So anyway, now at least you know what a clean HDMI or a not clean HDMI looks like. Okay, game on. Now, if those distractions aren't too big of a deal on your camera, you can actually pass this through other things like I'll show in OBS and zoom in and crop some of those things out. But that's beyond the scope of necessarily this video. Now, how do we actually get this thing to work? Let's go over to, in this case, we'll use WebEx this time, and let me show you how this works if we want to set this up and get it working like we did on that Zoom call. So we'll go over there. Let me change this over so instead of you seeing my camera, we're going to actually see my video here. And if I pull up WebEx and I go to settings, similar to what we saw in Zoom, I can set the speakers, I can set the microphone. We know the microphone's actually working because we're seeing this thing bounce around. That's great. So I'm not on mute for the first couple minutes of the call as we're scrambling around. And as we scroll down, I need to change over to what webcam that we're actually going to use. In this case, instead of this cam link, I've got its big brother called an HD60S Plus that I have hooked in, and that's what we're going to use for video. Actually, let's turn that on. Not a bad thing to double check that this is actually working before we get into our meeting, and we're good to go. We're off to the races. We can jump in our meeting, and now this is being used as a webcam. Now, the other disclaimer I'll give you around DSLRs is, as I mentioned, this is using a 24mm f2.8 aperture lens. Very, very small lens, fairly broad spectrum, and it's going through a crop sensor. Not overly important to know all of those things. Most of the cameras you're going to buy right now probably have a crop sensor associated with them. But these cameras give me a huge range of control over what I can do. So I can take something like this lens that was on my T3i, pop that thing off, and this is a 50mm 1.8 aperture lens. This is going to be a bit more zoomed in, and it's going to give me even more light if I'm in a lower light setting. The last thing we'll do with this camera is let me pop this thing on and show you what that's going to look like, just so you have an idea if you're going and shopping around for something like that. Of course, don't use this as your only point of reference. Do some extra research. I just don't want you to jump out and buy something and not have any idea of what that's going to look like. So let's get this thing on here. All right, so now I realize we're very zoomed in, and this is a 50 millimeter lens with a f1.8 aperture on it. What we were using before was this guy right here, which is a 24 millimeter lens. If we can get that in focus, let's get a little bit of light on it. There we go, 24 millimeter lens with a f2.8 aperture. If you're not familiar with both those settings, first off, the 24 millimeters versus the 50 millimeters, that's basically going to show you how zoomed in it is, the focal length of the lens, and that 2.8 versus the 1.8, that's the aperture, the iris more or less that's opening and closing. At 1.8 versus 2.8, this lens is bringing in more than twice as much light as what this was bringing in. Not a big problem in this case because I'm blinded by, that's a terrible joke, light all over the place. But maybe in a darker setting is more important. Make sure you check some of those things out as you're going through this. The other thing to be aware of if you're only loosely familiar with lenses is this camera is a crop sensor camera that we're using right now. Most of the Canon cameras that you'd pick up are going to be crop sensor cameras until you get into a fairly expensive range. And the CMOS sensor that's within these cameras, basically you take the lens, in this case a 24 millimeter lens, that one a 50 millimeter lens, and you need to multiply it by 1.6 to understand what the actual focal length is going to appear to be once you put it on your camera. So in this case, this 24 millimeter lens, this is actually going to look more like a 38 millimeter lens from other full frame, full sensor cameras. This 50 millimeter lens that I have right now is going to look something more like an 80 millimeter lens. So you need to put that in perspective if you're following somebody on YouTube that's talking about the distance on a different camera that does have a full frame sensor. And the other thing to be aware of is the aperture. Again, larger number on the aperture, less light. Cool. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do, let me put that down, is, there we go, a little safer there, is using the exact same setup that we have right now. We're going to do one final test. Now, this is not going to look anywhere near as good as these camera sensors are looking right now, but we're going to use this old GoPro Hero 3 camera. Now, there are a lot better GoPros at this point. I would not go buy something like this if you didn't already have it laying around, but this thing will work in the exact same setup that we have right there. To point out as well, pretty critical on your GoPros, if you don't have one that has a HDMI port like that on there, this is not going to work. So like your GoPro Sessions, do not have an HDMI output, not going to work on that. The GoPro Hero 8 also does not have an HDMI port. So if you want to get the latest GoPro because you're going to use it for other things like outdoor activities and also want to double up as a webcam, go for the 7. Don't go for the 8. So anyway, let's swap this out. You'll see one final image and we'll wrap this up. Okay, so there's no way around it. I cannot get a good image out of this Hero GoPro 3 Black Edition. It's not a hardware issue. As far as everything after the camera, I've seen videos supposedly of Hero 3 GoPro Blacks that are giving great images. The cam link worked great on every other camera that I've used it, so I don't think it's anything outside of that. I think it's in the camera itself. So I mean, keep in mind that this is a device that was made for outdoor wide-angle activities back in 2012. Now, I will give GoPro a nice bump in that you can control it completely from your phone. So that's pretty cool to be able to change those settings there. The problem is, as I mess with the resolution, the FPS, the field of view, all these various different settings, it dramatically changes the image distortion and how this image is coming across. This is about the best image I could figure out how to get here. And you're seeing the back of the monitor because I just didn't want it covering the ceiling. A little bit from a fact perspective, this is supposedly supposed to have a f2.8 aperture, which is the same aperture as the Canon lens that we were using for the majority of the times that we were looking at the DSLRs. It supposedly has a 5 megapixel CMOS sensor in it. At 12 megapixels in the setting, it's supposed to work with 108-degree wide angle field of view. At the 7 megapixel setting, it's supposed to work in a medium angle 93-degree field of view. And I guess the one fact I can say that's consistent on all these is that it's a focus-free fisheye aspherical lens. So pretty cool if you're doing action cam activities. But this particular one just cannot seem to get a more narrow focus for this business sort of purpose. Now, that being said, as I did more and more research into the various different Hero, GoPro options, if you jump ahead from 2012 to the Hero 5 or later, they introduce a linear field of view option. So if you have something like a Hero 5 Black, which you can get on Amazon for about $135 currently, I have a feeling that image is going to be much stabler, much more stable, much better coming through. Now, of course, you still are going to need an HDMI capture card, whether it's something like this Elgato setup that I have right now, or one of the ones that I mentioned for, say, $20 or so. So that could present a better option for you than forking over $180 for a webcam that is supposed to normally be 60, 70 bucks. But check those out. One disclaimer I will give you is that, again, any of the Heroes that don't have an HDMI output, which is primarily like the Sessions, the kind of more off ones, not their normal lines, the 3, 4, 5, 6, what have you, those are not going to be able to stream a signal like this for you. Well, not even like this. They're not going to be able to stream a signal out of them, period, because they don't have an HDMI connection to go into a capture card. The only one that does allow a USB connection for a webcam is the latest one, the Hero 8 Black, or Hero 8. Only problem is the only webcam software that GoPro has available only works for a Mac. So don't go out and buy the latest Hero camera, the 8, and think that you're going to get that to work. If you really want something for an action camera that's going to double up as a potential webcam, I'd check out the Hero 7. I think you can get the Hero 7 Black for about $250 currently on Amazon, so that might turn into a decent option for you if the capture card makes sense as well. So anyway, I cannot end this video on this terrible image. So let's check out one more thing. Let's have a little bit of a discussion over here. So thanks for tuning in to what turned into kind of my side art project at nights over the last couple weeks when the kids were asleep. Hopefully there was something beneficial in here for you. A few closing points. First off, to the great solution engineers and pre-sales folks that I work with. This is a terrible example of how to deliver a precise, concise presentation. So you're in your role for a reason, and I'm the rambling sales guy here. Other things to note, I was trying to put a video overlay when I was showing the Canon T3i. If you didn't catch that, wanted to point out that I didn't notice when we were recording, it didn't notice when I've used it for a webcam, but when that image blew up full screen, there was a lot of clipping, a lot of frame drops, and so make sure to keep that in mind if you're going to use a camera like that or something in particular that's not supported by the webcam software, in this case Canon. It was pretty choppy video actually when we blew it up. Other things to note, I tried to film a video around using something like this, a handy cam. This particular one does not have streaming out of the USB, and it does not have an HDMI out. So this kind of knocked that out of the park, so we couldn't necessarily use that, although there are plenty of handy cams for a couple $100 that have all those features and functions, and you end up having a handy cam if you want to use that also as a webcam. Also, for the Hero GoPro, while I wasn't able to get a great image quality out of that, you just saw that. If you were able to do something like that, I'm sure folks would love to see what that image quality would look like. Make sure to post your videos down below in the comments if there's something that you'd like to share. While this video was all about improving video quality, let's make sure we don't discount the audio side of things as well. If you have a terrible audio feed, that's not helping us either. And so would not use onboard microphones from webcams or things like that. You can easily hook in things like AirPods or something like what I'm doing here is that I'm using a shotgun mic that's above me, not this particular one, but a shotgun mic. And for $15 or so, you can get something like a lapel mic to be able to clip on, greatly improve your audio quality, 3.5mm jack right into your computer, or you can go completely off the deep end and do something like one of these condenser mics that you've seen behind me. Maybe I'll do another video on audio for business settings. Let me know if you're interested in diving into that. The last thing is I wanted to mention, I'm going to do one other recorded video on using OBS Studio. This is particularly critical if we want to set up a virtual cam to ingest a camera feed and spin it back into a different system. In particular, GoToMeeting is the one that comes to mind, where it's not doing its internal rendering or downsampling. I need to send the camera feed through a different set of software. But there's other things that are really important you can do with OBS. So for example, all the audio signals that I was using, well, I was using one audio signal, but all the cameras had a different level of delay compared to the audio signal I was sending in throughout this video. It ranged somewhere between 3 milliseconds and 11 milliseconds. Most of your web meeting options don't have an option to input an audio delay, so the video and the audio will come slightly off from each other. Not a big deal. At 3 milliseconds, gets a little more noticeable at 11 milliseconds. Something like OBS Studio will allow you to actually put a delay in your audio signal so that everything's synced up when it's coming out through the virtual cam. Also, something like OBS Studio allows you to get into all sorts of visual settings that may not be easily accessible through your default camera software, or I've had webcams that I was testing out over the last several months that had no software associated with them. So OBS Studio lets you change a lot of your video, color, blur, different settings that are in your camera. It also lets you get into your sound mix. And then finally, I want to mention, while this is just kind of my take on rolling up a lot of content that I've learned over the last several months from other content creators. I'm not a content creator. This is about the only thing that I think I have out on YouTube right now. But there are phenomenal experts to learn from. Going down a list, if you want to learn more about video, cameras, improving your video signal, Adam Taylor, Epos Vox, he's really the inspiration for this particular video. He did something very interesting like this, where he was going through different budget camera setups so you're not feeding the price gougers. And so check him out. Sean Cannell on Think Media, Peter McKinnon if you're looking to get into audio video transition and things that I've been having some fun with here, Harris Heller with Alpha Gaming. He gets both into video and audio, but audience is mostly for people that are doing Twitch streaming and things like that, but there's still a lot that you can take away from it. If you're particularly interested in the audio side, Mike Delgadio with Booth Junkie, Bandrew Scott with Podcast Stage, they're great to check out as well. Finally, if you found this to be beneficial, please share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues. I make this for you and for no other purpose. And thanks for watching. I wish you the best of luck in everything that you do.